Hey, it's me again. You may have just seen me talking to Malcolm Nance. So, welcome to this non-stream with Malcolm Nance. Unfortunately, we had to close it, but that's because we had this other stream planned with Alan Eyre, who is the Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute. He's been on the show, I think, about a handful of times now, 5 or 6 times possibly. He's just a really good person to dive into the diplomatic angle. Well, he doesn't hold back in his opinions. I think he thought we were meeting on a different platform, so hopefully he'll join us in just a moment. But yeah, I'm very excited to see what happens with the Xi Trump meeting. We ended our conversation with Malcolm on that point, and I'm interested to see what that means. I'm very fascinated by the war in Iran, and I try to follow the Middle East, but frankly, my area of expertise is great power competition. So China, Russia, America. I know more about China than I do Iran historically and, well, contemporary. So I'll be more in my wheelhouse, able to share even more of my thoughts than I do already about the Chinese American meeting. So be on the lookout for that. But otherwise, yeah, I think what Malcolm said throughout our conversation was very pertinent. Some of his analogies were extremely good. He's just such a good orator, right? He's got such good stories, such good ways of sharing that information and making it more accessible like that. But let's just see. Right now, we've got some. Yeah, I worry, to be honest with you, that the Israelis, if they continue hitting Lebanon really hard, could keep hitting, trying to hit Hezbollah supposedly really hard, that could be a trigger point, a bit of a deal breaker for the IRGC. So, yeah, because there's a lot of activity right now in the past, but in the time we were talking with Malcolm, the past like 25 minutes, the Israelis have been intercepting, quote, suspicious aerial targets. But I see Alan is with us. Afternoon, Alan. Hello.
I thought I went to the wrong URL.
Yeah, there's a couple. I should guess. I need to clarify which one. But it's good to see you. And I mean, there's a lot going on. When did we last chat? I think it was sometime last week, right? A few days back.
Ago, yeah.
Yeah. So in that time, there's obviously been another diplomatic merry-go-round of Trump sounding like it was positive and their counter proposal, or the proposal being countered with the Iranians. And now we're back at square one. It's totally unacceptable, Alan. It's just totally unacceptable. And you're going to have to fold. Otherwise, we're going to unleash hell, I think, is Trump's latest comment. So are we just back at square one, or is this any different to you?
Well, we never left square one. So this is like one of those optical illusions. The only reason you think we left square one is because the rhetoric changed. If I say everything is great and I say everything is lousy and the underlying situation hasn't changed, that perhaps creates an illusion of motion. The two sides were always very far apart. There's no dialogue. There's just two monologues passing in the night. Neither side is yet ready to negotiate. The Iranians think that the U.S. is seeking to topple the regime, and that negotiations are just a trick. And the U.S. still thinks that with just a little more incremental pressure, it can get Iran to bend the knee, kiss the ring, and accept their, in Iranians' eyes, maximalist demands. So it looks like we're heading toward another round of military action, where after President Trump finishes his China trip, we bomb some more stuff. Iran bombs some more stuff in the GCC countries. And then we see if anything's changed.
So you think that we're just, well, actually, I'll just bring this up to speed. So some of the latest developments in the past couple hours, past half an hour even, Galibaf said that the country, he's the parliament speaker, he said that the armed forces are ready to deliver a well-deserved response to the aggression. Obviously, that's when Trump said that the ceasefire is on life support. So do you think that we're actually on the precipice of the whole ceasefire thing, let alone peace talks, but the whole ceasefire just collapsing?
Yeah, see, there again, that's not news. That's like such a dog bites man story. Golubov says if attacked, Iran will respond. Okay. Yeah. So there's a ceasefire. Yeah, it's incredibly fragile. It is likely it will, regardless of whether you say it's been violated or not, it is likely, after, especially after President Trump comes back from Peking, that hostilities will resume. So again, yeah, I mean, there's a massive news complex. It's a war, like what is it Hearst said? You provide the war, I'll provide the pictures. So there's this constant thirst for news, but literally nothing has changed since the first couple of days of the war.
Okay, so all right. Well, that was a good conversation, Alan. I really enjoyed speaking with you again. Nothing's changed. I don't know what else to say. No, okay. I'll ask you one quick question. So I just came off.
You ask as much as you want. I mean, I'm happy to talk about development. I'm just saying that, there's sort of the basics and there's periphery. Periphery is, President Trump says something stupid or something excessive or something hyperbolic. Iran says something bellicose. There's a trading of of fire where Iran fires on a Navy ship and the Navy fires on Iranian, bog hammers or something. So I'm not saying it's not consequential, because against this all, the only thing that's germane is that which we do not see, which is the quality and quantity of messages being passed between Iran and the United States by Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, right? So the problem is that it's not, in real diplomacy, I don't present you a proposal and you go, yes, no. It's, here's my latest position. You go, well, I like this, this, this. I don't like this, this, this. How about this? And you come back. And it's an iterative process. That iterative process hasn't even started yet. Okay? I don't know how quickly messages are being exchanged, but if, for example, it took 10 days for Iran to respond to President Trump saying, here's a proposal, yes or no, it shouldn't be binary. It shouldn't be yes or no. It should be this ongoing conversation. Now, I think that's a necessary but not sufficient condition, because I think, if they were in the same room with the doors locked, I still think at this point it's unlikely they'd reach a negotiated solution, just because they're not there yet.
Well, I mean, no, it's obviously it should go without saying. I think that there's such a desire among certain communities, especially on social media, to make alarmism out of something which is largely subdued relative to where we were a week ago, when there was an actual fog of war and miscalculation and quite large escalation. Not much has changed really since the exchanges over the UAE. So what, 4 days, which in diplomacy is a long time. So what do you think about, therefore, I ended the last stream I had with Malcolm Nance asking him this, and he gave quite an interesting response, but I'm curious how you compare, which is, do you think that if the Israelis continue this sudden increase in strikes that have been occurring with Lebanon in the past 2-3 days, if this intensity continues, could that be a deal breaker for the IRGC?
Well, there's no deal to break, but certainly, yeah, it is the case that Israel, it is the case that one of the prerequisites that Iran has is cessation of hostilities throughout the region. Underline, Israel has to stop attacking Hezbollah, right? Israel doesn't want to do that. First of all, because it likes destroying its enemies as opposed to negotiating with them. And secondly, because it's perfectly happy if bilateral negotiations between the U.S. and Iran break down. It wants them to break down. It has said, we have not finished the job. There's more to attack. Don't forget, Israel wants this regime collapsed. Netanyahu said as much in his 60 Minutes interview. So, yeah, Israel is actively seeking to scuttle the already remote possibility of a negotiated solution between Iran and the United States. By, among other things, attacking, Tyre, attacking, Dahia, all these places.
No, I know that's obviously the game of the Israeli government. There's nothing more that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and likes want. But more my point is, would Iran feel baited enough to go into that?
Well, Iran is not going. It's not going to. Iran will not. I think it is unlikely it will resume hostilities. For example, firing against GCC countries because Israel has broken the ceasefire. It might launch against Israel. But still, no, I think it's going to take for Israel to ramp up kinetically. I think it would take, the U.S. doing it first. But it's also not going to throw Hezbollah under the bus. It's not going to make a separate peace with the United States if Israel keeps attacking Lebanon and trying to disarm it, and annexing South Lebanon. So, Iran is watching what Israel is doing in Lebanon very closely. But the key point here is, or a key point is that, Iran doesn't think that the other side of this is peace. Okay. Whatever happens, Iran sees itself, the IRGC elites running the country now, sees itself on a war footing. And so whatever happens, at best, it's a ceasefire in the Iranian military's eyes. And they will remain on a war footing, partly because it benefits the IRGC running the country to say we're still at war. It allows them to do things and to rationalize the massive, economic distress people are feeling.
I saw one report that stated they have been, exporting, is that the right word? A lot of their crucial military hardware to places like Pakistan. Like, this ceasefire has been benefiting the defense.
Plane. Yeah. They parked some planes in Pakistan, which evidently incensed Senator Graham. That makes sense.
But how beneficial is that to them? In your experience of ceasefires, is it usually the defensive side that benefits more than the offensive?
How beneficial is it of Iran to prevent their aircraft from being destroyed by the U.S. and Israel by moving it to another country? Yeah, it's not going to change the balance of the war, but it preserves some assets that are hard to replace for whenever the hostilities cease. Iraq did the same thing during the 2003 war. They flew all their planes, or many of them, to Iran and parked them there. Of course, the bad news there was Iran never gave them back.
And then the report also from the intelligence was that only 70% or 30% of the stockpiles are being destroyed. So from what we understand from your experience being part of negotiations for the nuclear deal, how much underground facility space does Iran potentially have? Like, they've moved so much of their equipment and stuff underneath the ground, like the Americans can't really target it, right? So that makes they've got an indefinite survival.
Well, before I answer that, let me just point out that, especially during wartime, especially when the war is not going well, everybody leaks. So every single one of these stories you read in the paper about, U.S. intelligence says X or Y, you have to think, what was the motivation of whomever leaked that to the reporter they have good relations with? It could be because it's true and they feel the U.S. public needs to know. It could be for other reasons. So you got to take everything with a grain of salt. But yeah, there's no doubt that Iran maintains a significant defense industrial base. And this is, the problem here, it's a failure of imagination. The U.S., nobody, we're all, without getting too bizarre, we're great apes, okay? Our brain didn't evolve to deal with complex systems. It evolved to see a threat, often another person, fight or flight, all that stuff. So we think of Iran versus the U.S., right? And it's like a boxing match in a way. It's not like that. It's what's called a hyper object. Iran is a hyper object. You cannot conceive of it with a degree of granularity. So Iran's defense industrial base is huge. It's diverse. It's redundant. As you point out, much of it is underground. So I don't know how much of it survived, but I know that a lot of it did. And that which did not survive will be reconstituted whenever the war is over, because Iran wants to reestablish deterrence. It's an incredibly hard thing to do to use a Trumpian term, obliterate an enemy's military, right? You can't do it from the air. You can't do it in the amount of time we've had. We've dealt them a serious blow in terms of sinking hardware and assets and destroying relationships and killing key leaders. But this is a country of 95 million people that has existed in one form or another for 5,000 years, despite being conquered by everybody, right? So, Iran can take a punch, to go back to the very same simile I was saying was too simplistic.
Now, in your years of experience working on the JCPOA, to what extent would the Iranians dig in versus at what point would they compromise? What is the tipping point there for them to deviate either way, either side?
That is a great question. The late Ayatollah Khamenei talked about narmesh kahramane, which is heroic flexibility. It was a buzz phrase during the nuclear negotiations. And again, because he never wanted to give his stamp of approval to the nuclear negotiations, he said, he wanted to keep a distance in case it went south. But he said, you negotiate and, we'll see. And so what that means, it means a flexibility in tactics, but you don't change your principles. So Iranian diplomats are really good. They know their portfolios. They know international law. They know how to negotiate. They know their red lines. They have strategic patience. So, it's aggravating, but yeah, they're very, very good. And yeah, they're willing to be flexible because, again, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, negotiations are a pair of scales, right? And the more you put in the I want this from you scale, the more you have to put in the I will give this to you scale, right? So Iranians have certain red lines, but within the context of those red lines, they're very flexible. And that's why if we had a competent U.S. administration that was willing to negotiate in earnest over long periods of time, a deal could be reached, both on the nuclear issue and on the Strait of Hormuz issue. Unfortunately, we have an administration that has strategic attention deficit disorder and isn't willing to put in the time or to create a win-win situation, because the U.S. administration is saying it is not enough that I win. Iran must be seen as humiliated by everybody. And that's not going to happen.
So just one point here. I'm curious, do you think there's a distinction between strategic patience and strategic endurance? One sounds more like a choice versus the other, which is a bit more imposed on one. Or is it a bit of an nuance that doesn't really matter?
Well, strategic endurance, again, the Iranians have their back to the water, right? Their goal is survival. I was actually thinking it would be interesting to contemplate, is there a point where you put so much pressure on this Iranian government or elite that they capitulate before they collapse? I don't know if that's necessarily true. It could be that, the IRGC running around right now say no until there is, in fact, a failed state in Iran and they go away because there's anarchy. We're not close to there yet. But strategic patience, I think Iran has. They're,
well, that's my point is, Alan, that strategic patience strikes me as a luxury, that you don't have a time horizon. For me, the Iranians obviously have a lot of time, but it's not indefinite.
No, they don't have time, but they know they've got more time than the U.S. They know that the blockade is hurting them, but they know that they're hurting, the global economy at a much quicker rate, and that the global economy has a much lower pain threshold. So, again, I think I've said this to you before, Iran has a plan for after they're punched in the face. They're not going to be rattled by being bombed. Okay. The guys running Iran right now, most of them served in the Iran-Iraq war. They saw their friends die. It was 8 years of this, trench warfare. The Iraqis use chemical weapons, use nerve gas. So they don't get rattled.
So one of the things that I've always found fascinating about following the backdoor diplomacy and engagements between the two sides is it's always through intermediaries, and they're not even in the same rooms. Right. I remember very vividly in early, I think February of 2025, when there was a lot of, when they were in Oman and they were shuttling between the two sides. To what extent would it take for the Iranians and Americans to engage directly? Or that's never a situation which would occur because both sides don't trust each other that much? Or what is it that requires them to always have the intermediaries?
Well, I tell you, I mean, obviously, first of all, for the 2 years of the JCPOA 2013 to 2015, after Rouhani got elected, after Obama decided to get serious, we did meet face to face. You know, then that was one of the things that really accelerated progress. Both sides wanted to meet. We met face to face, weeks at a time, at the expert level, at the principals level, you know, working group, sub-working group. You know, the conversations were in English. So in that context, face to face, direct negotiations over long periods of time were a massive accelerant. However, and this is a recent conversion on my part, I'm beginning to believe that face-to-face negotiations between the U.S. and Iran are suboptimal, that we don't want that. You know, just because it could be the toxicity bilaterally is so great, and also because our negotiators aren't that good. You know, I mean, Mr. Witkoff and Mr.
I hope you're not talking about yourself there, Alan.
No, I'm talking about the current administration. I mean, again, I was a subject matter. Yeah, I was a subject matter expert for. I mean, I was advising our own team more than I was, you know, interacting with the Iranians. But
I'm just joking.
Yeah, I know. But the point is that, you know, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are not going to sit in a room for 2 to 3 months, you know, hammering out the fine points of multi-page text. So maybe it's good that other countries do the heavy lifting and present, you know, ideas and concepts and text to the United States, who can then say yes or no. So, yeah, you know, it's like having a catalyst. You know, it could be that that direct bilateral negotiations at this point, with the enmity between the two, is just a bad idea.
So the other thing that I've always found fascinating is what country steps forward or emerges eventually as the intermediary, because before the peace talks or whatever attempts at a ceasefire really gained momentum, there seemed to be a vying for it between sort of Turkey, Pakistan, Oman. So two-pronged question here. But firstly, what does that mean, if anything at all, when you've got different countries vying it? Obviously, they've got all their own self-interests. But second, what does each individual country mean? Is there a big distinction between the type of intermediary and how much that can influence the talks themselves?
Yeah, I mean, you want a country that both countries trust to an extent, someone that's experienced in this. Pakistan fills the bill. It seems to be the case now that the Iranians are trying to supplement Pakistani mediation by going to other countries like Qatar. You know, some of the press rumors are that the Pakistanis, in Iranian eyes, are too close to the U.S., and at least some of the IRGC military seem to think that Qatar does a better job of relaying IRGC messages. You know, so, you know, they say that too many cooks spoil the broth. So it could be, if you have too many intermediaries, messages get muddled. But yeah, again, Pakistan's done a good job, but the only requirement for a successful, you know, mediator is that there's a minimum of trust between the mediator and each of the two principals. And that seems to be the case both with Pakistan and, to an extent, Qatar.
What about non-state actors? Why do we not see, well, obviously Trump has no faith in the UN at all, but why do we not see the Iranians? Well, no, actually, I'll take a step back. Back to your point about the skillfulness and masterclass that Iranian diplomats have, because people who are inherently anti-Iran or whatever, the IRGC, they hear me saying, oh, well, we have to recognize the skill, the craftsmanship that Iranian diplomats have. And they're like, oh, okay, so you're pro-Islamic Republic. Well, no, I mean, I can recognize the skill of the diplomats, the technocratic skilled, trained, whatever, experienced individuals versus the ideological government that runs the country domestically, right? That's lazy, intellectually lazy and conflation. But more my point is that I'm trying to get at is that in the 12-day war, they would send diplomatic communiques to the UN, right? Being very explicit, telegraphing their position, their behavior, their etc. So what does that tell us about the Iranian approach to sort of talks versus the Americans like that, or at least under the Trump administration?
Well, first of all, let me make the same point you just made, which is that pointing out U.S. government incompetencies doesn't mean you're supporting the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, implicit in all my statements is the Islamic Republic of Iran is a brutal, repressive, regime that violates the rights of its own people. So, just because you dislike the way one side conducts its business isn't an approval of the other side. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, Iran, one of the salient realities of Iran since the revolution is that they think the whole world is out to get them. They don't trust everybody. They saw the whole world, in their eyes, turn their back on them during the Iran-Iraq War, even when Saddam was using weapons of mass destruction. They've seen, sanctions being used by Europe and the U.S. to cripple their economy. So even the strong relationships are essentially transactional between Russia and China. As for the UN, they have no faith in the UN. Still, they always use the machinery of the UN to register their concerns. They know the UN's, rules, regulations, especially Zarif when he was foreign minister. So the foreign ministry of Iran knows how to play the UN's machinery and apparatus like a piano. And they're never going to not do what needs to be done at the UN and use the machinery of the UN. It's just they have no faith in it. For example, this was an illegal war, right? It violated, there's the justifications the UN gives for allowing warfare. It didn't meet that criteria. Iran pointed that out, but it doesn't expect the UN to do anything. It sees the United Nations as being captured by the imperialist power of the United States in their eyes. Now, for Iran, fortunately, they've got China and Russia on the UN Security Council, which gives them some breathing room. But they're not going to depend on the UN for anything. But they're always going to, do that which they need to do to register their disapproval of what's being done against them.
But you'd agree it's a game of narratives for that. They're trying to get the international community to look at them sympathetically from a narrative standpoint.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, Iran is, as someone who's had to read Iranian narratives for 40 years, they've got an alternative narrative that is both internally consistent and for them convincing. But there's a reason why, for example, Iran has cells in Iraq and Lebanon, but not in Switzerland or Germany, right? It's because Iran's narrative only resonates mostly resonates in, Islamic countries that are that are functioning suboptimally. Okay. So, their narrative, like, for example, for a while I worked countering Iranian disinformation at the State Department. And my days were boring because Iran's not that good at it. It was only after October 7th, after the terrorist attack of Hamas on Israel, that their strategic messaging became better because all they did was what everyone else was doing, which is, retweet pictures of dead Palestinian babies and mothers being pulled from the Gazan rubble. Absent that, they're not good at foisting their narrative.
Interesting. So they're good in some ways, but not in others.
What they're good at is, like, for example, I was in Afghanistan in late 2001 after 9/11 when we went back in the country. They're good at putting boots on the ground and handing out blankets and food and helping, those groups. They don't pick. They did the same thing in Iraq. They don't pick winners. They let 100 flowers bloom, 1,000 flowers bloom. They throw money to everybody, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. We were having internal meetings in Afghanistan on how to distribute aid while they were out giving Afghan farmers, wheat crop, or seeds and stuff. So they're not, or look at Syria, they're willing to put boots on the ground to support their allies. So this is how they perpetuate their influence. It's not through ideology. It's through, and a lot of times, just money. Look at how they've been able to capture the Iraqi political system. They buy it.
So with all that in mind, then, with the merry-go-round circus happening in the Strait of Hormuz, what do you think the biggest flashpoints, if any, are going to be? Or we're just going to stay in this circle jerk for the next 6 months, month?
No. There'll be an escalation, either a conscious one by Trump, or there'll be an escalate President Trump, or there'll be, because there'll be an escalation of hostilities. The underlying dynamic. I mean, the Persian Gulf is very small. You don't forget. Remember when the Vincent shot down the civilian airliner, right?
Yeah.
Because things happen quickly. There's a lot of military hardware in a very small space. So, even without intent, accidents can happen. And the dynamic right now in the Persian Gulf is escalatory. Okay. The IRGC is not interested in a proportionate or performative or perfunctory response. They need to try to establish escalation dominance, which is something each side is still trying to achieve. And when each side is trying to achieve escalation dominance, you get escalation. One side's defensive measure becomes another side's escalation, which provokes a response. So no, the status quo is not going to remain. There will probably be an escalation of hostilities. Israel could get its way and have, some type of infrastructure bombing in Iran if President Trump thinks that just a little more kinetic attention will shift the Iranian decision-making complex.
But what does just a little bit more mean, Alan? Like, what does the US have to give? How much can the Iranians put up with it? I mean, seemingly quite a lot based on your analysis there. And I mean, just to say, I mean, it does look a little bit like Trump's almost thinking maybe just sabotage the talks with his rhetoric. And let's try again a little bit of kinetic action. But to me, there doesn't seem the political appetite nor capital to return to what we had in March. We can't experience the same level of intensity of aerial bombardment, can we?
No, but then again, look, Trump's numbers aren't going to get any lower, right? He's at like 34%. His base is going to stay with him. Okay, so in his mind, the economy could get worse. And certainly he's got incredibly sensitive political radar. He doesn't want to get wiped out in the midterms for a bunch of reasons. But, he still thinks that additional military acts could change. He still doesn't believe that Iran won't do what the U.S. says because the U.S. did such a good job militarily. And again, you can explain that to him, but no one will, because that's one of the problems, is that no one is giving him, the hard realities he needs to hear. So he still thinks maybe we just haven't bombed them enough. He said today or yesterday that, we hit 70% of the targets, 30% are left. I don't know if he believes that. He makes numbers up, but, he's not mentally at a place where he says the domestic economic pain is so bad, I need to do something because kinetic action, military strikes aren't working. He might never get there.
I mean, I'm going to go out on a whim and say categorically, we're not going to boots on the ground. I see someone commenting that. No, that's not happening. And so, all right. Well, and also I'm impressed that you think the guy can even count to 100, to be honest, Alan. 70% or 30% or something, I'm not sure. But okay, I guess my last question really for you is simply, this whole idea is that at the end of this, if there ever is one, which I would really like there to be, that it's a JCPOA worse version. I've asked you this sort of before, but in the last few hours, they've put more sanctions on more people. The US is reveering back to sanctions again.
Yeah, why not? It's, of course. But
why not?
But here's the thing. He can say it's a better deal if he gets, and evidently, Iran is willing to suspend enrichment. We didn't get that under Obama. Okay. Iran, again, we didn't have to worry about 60% HEU, but he does. We didn't have to worry about the Strait of Hormuz. He does. But again, President Trump's claims of victory don't necessarily have an ontological underpinning. He just makes stuff up. And as I said, his base is going to believe it, right? So if he gets a deal where Iran downblends its HEU or sends most of it to Russia, accepts a freeze on uranium enrichment for 12 years, and agrees to IAEA inspections, that's as good as he's going to get. But he can claim that's better than Obama because Iran has agreed to suspend for 12 years. He said today, my goal is to make sure Iran never has a nuclear weapon for a very long time. Or earlier, a couple of weeks ago, he said, my goal is to make sure Iran never has a nuclear weapon during my administration. So, he can claim victory. The problem is, reality bats last, right? And the worst part of this war is the Strait of Hormuz being closed or the traffic in it being minimal. And so the key question of all of this, the single most important question is, at what point do maritime shippers feel confident to send ships into the Persian Gulf? Not to escape it as quickly as they can because they've been there for 70 days, but at what point does the maritime insurance industry say, yeah, okay, I will insure your vessel to go inside the Persian Gulf to pick up whatever? That's months away, best case.
Well, there's always a time lag effect with the economy, isn't there? Especially something as slow moving as heavy freight maritime means as well.
I know. For 1 second. The thing is that, all this economic pain is already hitting Asia, Africa, starting to hit Europe. It'll hit the US last. But at a certain point in July, we no longer have a deficit, which is an imbalance between supply and demand. We have a shortage, meaning we hit tank bottoms. There's none left. Diesel, LPG, right? Jet fuel. So, physical reality cannot be bludgeoned by administration talking points.
No, it's a supply side shock, of which makes the 1973 OPEC crisis, sort of similar levels of stagflation and heightened economic uncertainty. That's
someone else said it is the supply equivalent of the COVID economic shock, yes, which was demand reduction. It's the exact same thing, but the flip side.
Yeah, that is true. I know I said last question, but I'm going to be cheeky and ask bonus one, which is I just come up with bonus question. We're playing a video game here, right? Bonus round. No, simply, I want your take on what we could expect maybe from China, Russia, America summit in the context of the JCPOA. Both obviously, China was obviously a core signatory to that. Do you think anything's going to be said? Do you think the calculus will change for the Iranians? They'll be watching it, or it's not largely relevant in your opinion?
I mean, I think President Trump will ask China to help. I don't think he's willing to put chits on the table to get that. Partly because China already has a vested interest in the free flow of commodities out of the Persian Gulf into China. Even though it's interesting to me that they've cut their oil intake imports by like 20% in the last months. So they have a significant strategic reserve. But yeah, I mean, China obviously is the most important country in terms of leverage on Iran. I don't know to what extent they've used it heretofore. Evidently, they were instrumental. The Pakistanis used them to get Iran to accept the ceasefire. So they've got a role to play. They're not going to be the guarantor of any agreed upon solution in the Persian Gulf because they don't want that hassle. China has never shown itself eager to assume security responsibilities. And when Saudi and Iran made up, the Chinese role was there, but they're not going to. They didn't do heavy lifting. So yeah, I don't necessarily think that China can move the dial, even if President Trump were to make a deal.
All right. Well, we'll just have to have you back later on, hopefully in the week, Alan, to dissect some more of that. Always a pleasure. Everyone, Alan of the Middle East Institute, distinguished diplomatic fellow. I mean, I think this is like your 5th time. You're such a regular, Alan. It's great.
I know. I wish I had a card I could get punched, so I get like a free coffee or something. You know.
Oh, we can definitely. Well, I mean, if you have a book, we can get you a. You know, put the link in the description. Maybe you get some people buying your book.
I write a book, but I haven't started yet. So by the time I finish writing that book, peace will have broken out in the Middle East. So.
The Middle East will be resolved completely. But thanks very much, everyone, for watching. Do like, subscribe as usual for when Alan returns. Got plenty of guests tomorrow and for the rest of the week. But we'll see you all tomorrow. And Alan, thanks as always. Bye-bye.
Anytime. Take care.